Welcome to the Float Podcast, an entrepreneurial journey. My name is Nick Janicki, once a wide-eyed hippie with purple dreadlocks, and now the founder of the True Rest Float Spa, the fastest growing floating franchisor in the world, and CEO of FloatPod Technologies, the industry leader in float pods. Follow me along in my entrepreneurial journey with what will become the next billion-dollar industry to enter the health and wellness sector. Let's connect with world-class athletes, actors, musicians, doctors, industry experts, and explore the mindsets of powerful entrepreneurs. Let's get this floating party started. I wanted to welcome my guest today, Dr. Dan Engel. He's a very good friend of mine, and he just got done floating. So basically tell us about that. How was your float?
I'm still in that post-float glow.
Post-float glow. So did you fall asleep? Did you go unconscious during this float?
Towards the tail end, I fell asleep. The first, it's such a timeless state. For the first however long, the first majority of it was like super conscious, where you have this great separation, witness perspective.
Now, how many times have you floated? I mean, this is
in a pod? Or
did you know about it before I told you? You knew about floating first, right?
How did I first hear about floating? Oh, that's such a great question. No, I really have no idea. It's always been there. I know when you and I started talking about floating, it was like, oh yeah, of course.
You knew about it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's one of those things where there's this inherent yes. There's this deep knowing of truth. Like when you hear somebody speak, I've got my Sedona allergies kicking. When you hear somebody speak and they offer truth and deep wisdom, there's an inner yes.
So for you, floating was that
resonance,
deep truth.
Of course that's a profound modality. Of course that's what we're supposed to be doing on a regular basis. Of course that's going to be an awesome adjunct to whatever we're doing, whether it's healing our body, mind, spirit, heart, and soul, whether it's expanding our consciousness, whether it's desiring to find that oneness through meditation. It's just such an easy yes as far as a stackable, additive, excellent modality for anything else we're doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in this particular float, was there anything unique physiologically or psychologically?
Yeah,
because every float's a little different, is what I say. Every time you float,
totally.
You kind of get something new out of it,
And I hadn't floated in a while. It's been maybe like 18 months since I floated. I know. I know.
Man.
I know.
Crazy.
It's super crazy. Maybe 16 months. Still,
No float
long
tanks
time.
in Peru.
Way tall. No,
All
no
right.
float tanks in. Well,
bring some
you
down
float in a different way.
Right.
Especially when you're going down.
All right.
To
So
do work.
18 months.
Yeah.
And you got a good, 90-minute float in, pretty much.
Yeah, and what I noticed first of all is when I laid in and dropped in, there was it feels like you're already surfing the cosmos, like somatically, not consciously. My body, I had to look up at the ceiling to see if I was actually like whirling over towards the side of the pod. It was very noticeable. It was to the left, and it was this rotational kind of like whoosh, like it felt like somebody just took the pod.
So it felt like your body was being moved fast.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And once I looked up at the pod and I realized I'm stationary, but everything, like my internal gyroscope is on overdrive, feeling wonky.
Now, inherently, that's not an uncomfortable experience, right? I mean, would you consider that pleasurable, or?
It was surprising. It wasn't pleasurable. And what I noticed, though, it's a reflection of how much I've been moving. I've been constantly,
okay.
and that's fairly new. I've been doing so much traveling lately, and being in different locations and different beds and different sleeping environments and on the go, and when I realized that's what's happening, it was easier to find, because I'm always studying and I always like to try and track things and understand where they're coming from. So when I understood that's what was happening and that was the process, was like me finding my internal center, then it was a lot easier to like lock in on where that is in this consciousness, in this soma. And from that place, it was easy to just drop in and go out kind of at the same time. So there was this central axis that you can ride, that column. And sometimes in floating, sometimes I'll go up,
Mm-hmm.
really super conscious, and sometimes I go subterranean.
Got it.
And that's what happened at the end when I fell asleep. I just went deep and out, completely dissolved.
Now, do you think the environment, because I always say, the float pod environment is meditating you. I believe that. So the environment, it facilitates you being able to meditate. So would you say you're getting whatever you need out of the float in terms of...
Yeah. I think just like for sleep, if I'm able to drop it, like if I'm sleeping in a regular,
Mm-hmm.
particularly if I'm in my environment and it's known and I'm getting on a regular sleep cycle, whatever it is through that dream state, whatever's happening, whatever I'm working out, is just the right medicine for me to be receiving at that time.
Okay.
And floating's that same way. So if I need to go super conscious or subconscious or really just present and just watch, because I've had some floats where I'm just watching, and then I'm watching myself watch.
Okay.
And then there's no difference between the observer and the experience, and those have been profound times as well. And I geek out on that ability we have to watch our own watching.
Right.
And to have the distinct ability of consciousness reflecting on itself.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so what do you do normally to relax? So when you're not floating, what are the tools you use to normally relax and recenter? So if you don't have floating, what is something you do to get in that similar state?
Well, prior to traveling so much, it was spending a lot of time barefoot on the land.
Okay. So grounding and just being with nature.
Yeah.
Okay.
Swimming.
Yeah.
Spending a lot of time in my own kind of personal reflection. I like that.
And you travel a lot. I mean, you're going
lately.
You're flying down to Tijuana next week. You're in Peru a lot of the year, and so you're a busy dude.
Yeah, I've been traveling 10 out of the last 12 months.
Holy cow.
And that's supersonic for me, because prior to that, I don't think I left Sedona maybe twice in about 6-7 years.
Okay.
And so that trajectory is real different. So I have not yet consistently found or re-engaged an ongoing centering practice. And there's been so many things that have been so exciting over this last year or so, that I've just been riding that wave of excitement and joy and passion and creativity and networking and all the things that have been happening. So it like a kid who says, no, I'm not tired, and when they sit down they just kind of pass out. That's what it felt like towards the end of that float. So I was watching that whole experience of reconnection and my body kind of coming back into a center point. And then once I felt that connection to that column, it was out. It was like you just pulled the power plug. Right. And then when the music came back on, I had that experience that you've had before, where I didn't know where I was, I didn't know who I was, I didn't know what this body was, I had no idea of this present moment experience, and so and I kind of like that.
How long were you in there, in that place?
Probably for about maybe 2-3 minutes.
Okay. I mean, it's a rebirthing, right? I mean, it's kind of like you're going, okay, who am I and why am I here and what am I doing and where's my body?
And it can be kind of a little disorienting.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's funny because in the midst of that, there's a part of me that also enjoys that. It enjoys that entire rebirthing.
Right. It's like a reboot.
Now I can actually, this reforming experience of human stuff, this being human,
molecular blob,
we can really reform ourselves at any moment.
You're right. Well, what's the science? I mean, you're a doctor. I mean, what's the science? You're your whole body is going through 80% of your body cells are replaced every couple 18 months or something crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's true, right? I mean.
Yeah.
And so,
I mean 90. When you hit that 7-year mark, everything's turned over. But okay, then how is it that how is it that this consciousness, this experience, gains consistency over time? Or there's cellular memory. There's consciousness woven into this energetic matrix. It's not just it's not just physical.
Well, and that's where illness and stuff is interesting, whereas you're literally carrying over the illness from a reformat perspective. Right. And that's where I think, my belief is the future of the industry is going to be an integrative tool. So it's not going to be where floating is now, but it's definitely, you're going to start integrating other modalities into floating, be it, grounding the water, blocking EMF radiation. And I haven't seen any studies on this, but one of the theories I have, I'm curious to see what you think about it. But my feeling is that EMF, Wi-Fi signals are just like penetrating the microcosm. And I feel like it's having an effect. And I think this is why maybe ADHD and some of these attention deficit disorders are so prominent where they weren't 10 years ago. And this is just a theory. I haven't seen any research on this, but I really feel like when you get into the environment like the float pod, all that sort of starts to subside. And so I think if we can really figure out, okay, and we were talking about this earlier, if we can start doing some brain mapping and some scanning and stuff and showing the science behind what's happening when you're in there, I think you're going to find, you're obviously in a more isolated environment, but once you start blocking out not just light and sound, but EMF radiation, I think that's going to be a huge, a huge impact. And I think for the future of the industry, if we start integrating all those tools, I think you're going to make a leapfrog in terms of where, I don't want to say where medicine's going, but I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's like where humanity's going, where evolution is going. It's the pod is such a great internal laboratory to come back into the recreated self, the recreated physical self, the recreated emotional, mental self. I mean, just think about the opportunity that we have now, because as I was getting out of the pod, because this is a new style pod,
right?
And I saw the little two-way intercom, which is really rad. And as I was washing, I was rinsing off, and I was standing there, and I was thinking about me just reforming myself, coming out of that. It's really a rebirth, and so it's a controlled death experience in a way. And for many people, that can be super, super scary.
Sure.
If you have the opportunity to walk somebody, say somebody's healing trauma, or early birth imprints, or transgenerational programming, or whatever, and there's a challenge in the surrender to this present experience, to this reconfiguration of that traumatic part of the self, because trauma splits off consciousness. Trauma will skew a part of, and this goes way back in traditional teachings to quantum theory, when there's a coalesced part, cohesive part of the self that now becomes skewed through a traumatic experience. To re-engage that lost part of the self, you have to re-engage the trauma, and that for a lot of people that's really scary. So when you have something like the pod, to be able to gradually walk somebody into the reapproximation of that trauma, to transgress them to that place once they know where safety is, then you can re-experience the trauma. You can dissolve back into the matrix, whether it's through reunion with everything, or it's the disillusion into the nothing. Everybody has kind of a different take on where we go when we're no longer in this experience, whether we go back in everything or back into nothing. When you can safely and consistently help somebody reapproximate that traumatic part of the self, and this is, I think, something, and I'm still forming what just happened for me in that regard, because I've gone through a fair number of controlled death experiences, but there was something really profound about that one. And when you have the opportunity to use a modality where you're like somebody's floating and you're on the intercom with them, and you're stepping them down into a place of...
It's a perfect tool for a clinical environment.
It's amazing. And so you reapproximate that self, you welcome that part of the self back, and they come out of the egg, and it's funny how you come out of this egg reborn.
Right.
These are not cosmic jokes. These are this is really what happens. then you're helping people come back to a greater state of oneness within themselves, and then they can experience that within everything else.
And so what you're saying with the intercom is you're basically you're explaining or helping them through the process, or you could. I mean, I remember one of my buddies, when we first opened the store, he was in the frontal attack in Baghdad, and they keep these guys up on adrenaline shots for like 48 hours. And when he got out, he had literally, yeah.
Shooting it with adrenaline.
Yeah, that's frontline Marine stuff right there.
Crazy.
But they don't teach you how to reintegrate into society. They teach you how to be a soldier, but not how to be a normal human in society. So when he came back, it took me. I mean, he had a rough time. I won't get into it, but it took us a while, about 6 months, to convince his wife to come in. And after his first float, I just asked him how it was, and he said, second worst experience of my life. The first was when I had. He basically got hit by IED, relatively close proximity, got hit against a Humvee, went unconscious, so he had some spinal injuries, some brain stuff he was dealing with, on 5 different kinds of narcotics, 5 for pain, 2 for PTSD, and he said the worst incident, the worst memory he's ever had and the worst pain he's ever had was that accident, and in the float he essentially relived the experience on an emotional level and a physical level. And I'm not a doctor, but he said, that was really, I don't know what he used, but is that normal? And I said, actually, it's great, and please come back 5 more times. And so he came back 5 days in a row.
Good prescription.
Yeah, well, but yeah, so he came back 5 days in a row, and literally by the end of it, he was starting to get a tremendous amount of pain relief. He got to a point after the 7th float, he had no pain during the float at all, none, zero. And this is a guy that's been carrying pain for 10 years, and this is not uncommon. We're hearing this a lot. You get that that loading period is what I call it, which is like 6 or 7 floats. Once you get 6 or 7 floats in, I call it like the magic float. You start realizing this is a tool I'm going to use for the rest of my life. And so after that period of time, he basically was able to work his way off of most of his painkillers, and he's still working on some of the PTSD stuff. But he would actually just hang out in the spa after his float, and sometimes there'd be other guys that had PTSD, and he'd kind of like walk them through it. And so, it's just an interesting thing that my understanding of that.
He was now then coaching others through that process of healing.
Absolutely.
Using the pod.
Because he just knew what it could do, and he knew the first thing he had to do was sort of relive the emotional impact of that. Yeah. And then that's what started breaking down all of the pain. Yeah. And so it's a fascinating thing. Yeah. And now, he got to a point where I think he went 2 weeks without a float and without prescription medication for painkillers. And he called me on the phone and he said, I am having withdrawal symptoms, I'm nauseous from withdrawal symptoms, and I'm totally hitting a wall. If you don't get me in to float for like 90 minutes, I'm basically going to take painkillers, which there's nothing wrong with that. Some people need them. But anyway, he drove in, he did his 90-minute float, and afterwards, he comes in, he's kind of like anxious. He gets out, I just look him in the eye, and he's just like, he didn't even have to say anything. So powerful. So powerful.
Priceless.
Yeah.
You've just helped people, you've just, the pod, the experience, has just helped people re-engage life in a meaningful way. You've brought them out of that level of survival where they're either constantly in sympathetic overdrive. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is all about living in sympathetic overdrive. You're constantly scanning the environment of like, what's the ongoing threat? Okay. And so you've got that internal thing happening in the mind while the body's still negotiating vision and gravity and all these other things that the default mode network kind of has to do just to walk.
And gravity's a huge one.
Walk. And then you drop people into the tank and they dissolve back into the experience, to whatever experience. For me, it's a lot like going into ceremony. Ceremony can be...
And tell us, like a lot of people listening might not know what ceremony means. Give us a little background, and give us a background. I'd be curious to see what you've been doing. I know we were talking earlier about this in terms of the specifics of ceremony and how you're utilizing it.
Yeah. For me, the ceremony, when held in a good way, when held in mindfulness and
I think that's an important thing to say. Not hey, let's go get blasted and do some.
So the psychedelic experience, and the psychedelic experience is a mind awakening experience. It doesn't have to be medicine based.
So for someone that's never had any psychedelic experience and has a negative stigma, what would you tell that person?
I would say it's when held in a good way, when going in there with intention for healing, it's an awakening, healing consciousness expansion.
And you're using it as a doctor and as a medicine.
Yeah, right. And so it can be medicine-based,
right.
And those medicines are the entheogens and the psychedelics that we kind of have been hearing so much about lately. Ayahuasca, wachuma, peyote, iboga or ibogaine, psilocybin.
Mm-hmm.
These are the traditional native natural medicines. 5-MeO-DMT, the Sonoran Desert Toad. These are all the things straight from nature. These aren't. That's not an exhaustive list, but those are the ones that are coming online most because they have the most data lately.
Right.
And then you get into the synthetics like LSD, MDMA, some of the more kind of lab-driven psychedelics. And what psychedelic essentially means altering the mind. Psychedelic was that term.
Isn't that basically what all? I mean, your background's a psychologist. Isn't that basically what all drugs do to some regard? Is alter your mind.
Totally.
And so why is it that Lilly can make, not John C. Lilly, but the company Lilly, can make these, but then there's kind of a negative stigma for going back to nature for medicine. I mean, that seems to be the case.
Yeah. So we want to be able to, as best we can, in science, have a laboratory where there's the most reproducible experience possible. And when that gets drawn into a corporate dynamic that has profit as one of the driving, if not major driving factor, then that corporate mentality gets threatened, and the shareholders get threatened if there's any potential wane in the profit margin. So
is isolating a specific additive or chemical structure from a natural plant-based medicine, what is the pro and con of that? And why does science do that as a whole? It seems like we're extracting things from a complete compound.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, I have no background in it whatsoever, but it doesn't seem like that. It seems like nature maybe got it right.
Right. And, my understanding is just from the kind of political logistics is that you can't technically patent something that came straight from nature because you didn't invent it.
You can't patent a root.
Nature invented it.
That makes sense.
Right?
That's super funny. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
All right.
But you can patent the primary constituent if you found the extraction process to isolate it.
You can patent the process of extracting something useful.
Right.
You can't patent,
Right.
Got it.
Yeah, so, and when we get the opportunity to be able to, like, for example, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, can't patent that, straight from nature. You can try and patent the primary compound, and there's companies doing that right now. They've done similar things with ayahuasca, patenting the primary compound. Ibogaine is the primary isolate of iboga. Psilocybin right now is going into phase 3 trials.
Wow.
MDMA is going into phase 3 trials.
And so does that relate to the ceremony you were talking about earlier? So
well,
how do you integrate that into your ceremony?
When you come back, for me, the psychedelic experience is a mind-opening experience, mind-expanding experience. Sometimes it's hell for people. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. If people have...
It's just hard, you mean?
It can be.
Or like,
right, because
life-changingly hard.
You face your shit.
Right.
Now, the difference for me between drugs and psychedelics is that drugs are used, and again, this isn't judgment, this is just kind of a way to frame it.
Right.
Drugs are used recreationally as something to, just have fun.
Or, hide your sorrows or,
and you can also use them as distractions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And they can also have this really massive addiction potential.
So it's how you use them is what matters.
How you use them. And so that's the intention going in, right? The mindset going in. And then the outcome. The difference between drugs and psychedelics is that drugs are a disintegrating experience versus psychedelics are an integrative experience. So if you're coming out the other side in a worse off state, less than your ideal self, a bit more psychically or psychologically fractured, then that's more of a drug type experience. If you're coming out the other side, maybe it was hard, maybe it was uncomfortable, but you're facing your stuff, you're working through the trauma,
right?
Or you're coming out with this expanded state of like, when people go through the kind of the classic psychedelic experience when held well, it's like, what's the mystical experience? William James talked about the mystical experience. It's like oneness, unity, timelessness, a sense of what he described as the noetic experience, like receiving deep truth into the nature of the cosmos.
But it's about integrating it, right? I mean, from my understanding, it's not about the experience in and of itself. It's about how do you put that into your your true self? How do you integrate that into your whole? How do you integrate that into your daily life? So it's not about let's go do this thing. I change in this weekend, then I go back to where I was. It's you're integrating the lessons, right? And then you're reintegrating into who you are, and hopefully that's an elevation of awareness, consciousness. You're a better person somehow, whatever better means. But it's the reintegration. And I think that's maybe what you experienced a little bit today too, was, just in the thing I love about the pod and everything we're talking about, it's not, you don't even have to have something you can put into words. You just know sort of, it's like a level up. Amir, so Amir's awesome. So he works with us and he does a bunch of stuff, but we made a Facebook post of someone in a pod, and it literally, the only words on there was level up. So someone floating in the pod and level up. And so you just know, it's just like, something profound happened. I can't put it into words, but now I'm carrying that with me. That's part of who I am.
That's another quality of the mystical experience.
Leveling up?
That's one of the outcomes, right? Thankfully, because that's what happens, just naturally, is that the mystical experience is ineffable.
Right.
It's difficult to describe. So you come back with this, and that's one of the things I really love about people who are well written on the psychedelic path, or the entheogenic path, or the spiritual path. I mean, how do you Osho and Adyashanti and Krishnamurti, I mean, some of these guys were just so good at talking about what oneness is like. So much better than I am able to explain that. Like, Terence McKenna says, okay, well, the definition of the shaman is, it's the person that goes to the edge of the known, jumps over, has an experience, comes back, and tells everybody else what happened. Right? So it's the spiritualists do the same thing, whether they're the rishis and the sages on the cushion, or they're the people that are mindfully coming into ceremony. So again, if ceremony is the psychedelic experience, then it can be a sweat lodge, it could be a breath ceremony, it could be going up on the mountain for vision quest, it could be drumming, dancing, deep meditation, samadhi states, fasting. There's all kinds of psychedelic experiences. Using medicines, receiving medicines is just one.
So you don't have
avenue.
to do a drug even to enter into a psychedelic state, is what you're saying.
No, you don't have to receive a medicine in order to have a psychedelic experience. For me, I got turned on to the psychedelic experience after I'd done years of study in Tibetan Buddhism. And then for a while I was connected to a Lakota sweat lodge community, and I did some
So you used to meditate
quests.
quite a bit then, back in the day, right?
I think meditation's like the float pod. It just goes with everything.
Right.
It supports everything. There's different styles of meditation. Some people are more dynamic. For me, actually, I go through phases. Sometimes it's super easy to just sit and drop in. And then lately I found, because I've been traveling so much, there's this inertia behind my mind stream. So it's actually helpful to sit, and it's also more challenging. So if I'm able to do a walking meditation, or if I'm listening to a particular playlist that I have now that just really drops me in, or if I'm in the midst of like an ecstatic dance, these are all different styles of meditation.
It's a meditative state.
Yeah. So meditation is such an ally, particularly for using medicine, because it helps you more consistently find your center, and it helps you do exactly what you were talking about, which is the big missing piece, I think, for many people, desiring a sense of more meaning in their life, desiring more of what we would maybe call an awakening. So many people are looking for the experience, but they're not doing the integration. And the integration work is where you find success.
You can't read about an experience. You have to have it.
You have to have it. And then you have to integrate it.
Like,
how do we help those seeds? Because the experience will plant seeds for consciousness. Just like in the potential healing that happens in the pod, or potential healing that happens in the medicine circle. That's a seed for a potential awakening. It's a seed of recovery. It's a seed of coming back to oneself. But if you're in the midst of, after that, just like you painted this beautiful oil canvas, and the paint hasn't dried, and you start throwing that canvas all around, you try and stick it in your backpack and kind of go back into your 8 to 5 daily work life, that shit's going to get all smeared up and now it looks like crap again. right?
You did integrate it.
No.
Yeah.
And if we drop in.
Whew. And we're all guilty of that one.
Me so much.
Yeah.
Because I get into these times where I like to be in the lab.
Right.
So I'll go super deep, and I started going super deep with the medicine path, and I wasn't integrating. I was stacking all of these ceremonies.
Right.
I wasn't integrating, and as a result,
so you're following your passion, but you weren't kind of taking care of yourself.
right.
Right.
And it's so much.
Hey,
so
it happens. I know the feeling.
Totally. and then I went through this long depression.
Really?
Because what happens?
How long ago was this?
This is about 4 years ago.
Okay.
That's what took me out to Sedona, because
Okay.
I went to live in the jungle for a year because I wanted to study with ayahuasca.
Mm-hmm.
My first ayahuasca ceremony for myself and many people in the group, I saw what would have taken about 5 to 10 years of good psychotherapy happen in a 3-day workshop.
Really? Wow.
And when I saw that and felt that and experienced that happen
And that's your background is...
My background's in psychiatry and
Right.
child psychiatry and forensic psychiatry. So
Did you practice clinically, or?
Yeah.
So you did have patients that you were working with, and then you realized after you've seen this is, wow, these other things are more powerful than what I've been practicing. And how long were you in that field?
Yeah,
before doing the ceremony?
I had been running my own clinic for about 3 years, and then I decided to study more rejuvenation, holistic psychiatry directly from a mentor, because this is about 10 years ago, and there was only one guy who I could really find available to teach me his style of holistic psychiatry,
Right.
and that was Gabriel Cousins down at the Tree of Life. So I went down to the Tree of Life, was the medical director there for a couple of years under his guidance and support. And so after running my clinic in Portland and then being at the Tree for a couple of years is when I got really called to, so I did like my own, so to speak, fellowship in integrative psychiatry, and then it was time to do my like deep immersion in spiritual psychiatry. So I had this experience with ayahuasca where so much of me was reconfigured, split parts of myself that had been skewed through trauma and through cultural programming and individual programming and transgenerational programming. Many of these aspects got brought back into a whole, and I recognized that there was massive healing that happened in a 3-day workshop. So I decided to move down to the jungle, and I really wanted to study it firsthand. And what better way to than go back to the source and see how they're really doing it. And so in the midst of that, I went through a series of dietas. That's when you go really deep with the medicine. It's like a personal relationship just with the plants.
Okay.
And you're in a deep meditative space.
I'm glad you told me what the word was. I had no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, in isolation. It's like a Vipassana.
Okay.
With ayahuasca as you're getting to know these other plant teachers.
Right.
So,
and a lot of this is new for me too. Like I meditate. I've been meditating for 15 years, but I in college I tested some psychedelics, as we've talked about that before, but since I started practicing my meditation, I completely stopped. And what's fascinating, I would say, and you know this too, would you, like I feel like talking to you, I have psychedelic states naturally during the day, and I never called them that. And so, a lot of people, like a flow state is certainly one of them. I even have like imagery and visualizations during the day that I see, and it's just, so for me that's been a natural thing, and I've never considered that a psychedelic state.
Totally. You've accessed a particular level of consciousness where you experience greater
and a lot of this
sense
stuff
of ease.
freaks people out too. So I don't talk about it.
Well, it does, because so many people, myself included at times in the past, and so it's not judgmental, it's just kind of fact. So I can speak from both sides of it. Experience the cultural program, and it's like when you elect to take the red pill and wake up from the matrix.
Right.
That can be a really disorienting process. Like
right.
You get the whole like master plug from the cultural program pulled out of the back of your skull, and you realize that that's been happening for generations. That can be threatening because now you've just woken up to a new experience with the world.
Right.
And if we don't have a community that helps to validate that experience, it can feel really isolating. That's why I think many of the spiritualists and the teachers along the path said the spiritual path is a lonely path, right? Because there's so much of us that can feel like we're getting more and more isolated. And so when I went really deep with the medicines, I got manic eventually because I was just drinking because ayahuasca will upregulate.
So you don't have a peer group that you can... I
didn't at that time.
So you were doing this solo?
Yeah.
Really?
Because I I personally I like to do it that way.
So you're your own guide, but
it's not maybe the most mindful way to go, but
right.
I like to track my own personal experience. So I typically won't read other people's experience. I'll let people know, like, you know, not everybody climbs Everest. If you go, it's nice to go with a map and
a guide
and, you know, have a survival kit and
nice
know how to get off
right.
when the shit hits the fan. I don't always practice that that level of mindfulness and preparation. And there's a benefit to going in raw, because then you have a really personal experience, and there's nothing shaping it. So I'm not going in with expectation.
Right.
So I didn't go down to the jungle with expectation.
And you've gotten past most of the, you know, you don't have, I would say, you know, horrible addictions. Like, you're not addicted to crack or heroin, or, you know, you said you're even getting rid of sugar, you know what I mean? So, I mean, what if someone is, you know, really does have a serious drug problem or some kind of super hard behavioral issue, you know, what would your recommendation be in terms of, with an alternative route?
You have to have a support system.
Yeah.
You have to have a support system. So after I got manic, because ayahuasca upregulates everything, and that's why it's a natural antidepressant. Ayahuasca pharmacologically is equivalent to the first series of antidepressants that were ever patented and formulated. They're MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So all your neurochemistry gets upregulated, so you feel really good. And I've had a long history of depression throughout my family. Most of the people in my family are on antidepressants. One of my sisters passed away from suicide.
Wow.
3 out of 4 of my grandparents died from neurodegenerative conditions.
How did you get through that?
So we've got a lot of stuff, right?
So how did you get through that?
And so when ayahuasca started upregulating everything, I started feeling really good. And it was the first time I felt really good. So I kept going to ceremony. I did 40 ceremonies in 60 days, and I just kept riding that wave. And so I'm drinking from the fire hose, and I'm just so beautifully turned on. And as one of my teachers, Gabriel, had said to me a while back, you can't sidestep the spiritual path. You have to be able to, in order to utilize that much spiritual essence, juice, you have to create the container.
Right.
And I didn't create the container, so my container fractured, like Humpty Dumpty falling off the ledge.
Right.
So the other side of mania is depression. Hermetic law of the universe, right? Rhythm. What goes up is going to come down. Well, I was way up, so I went way down. And that valley was about a year-long suicidal depression. And that's what took me out to Sedona initially, because I came back into the States after the mania subsided. My sepsis, I was septic too. My immune system shut down. I didn't sleep for 3 weeks because I was downloading this volume on the interface between like integrative spirituality and holistic medicine. And it was this awesome manuscript that's still in the formation of being published. And in the midst of that, and many people will describe the manic experience, whether it's hypomania or mania full blown, it's feeling really good. And so you're like turned on to the like cosmic energy of what birthed consciousness.
Right.
And that isn't necessarily something you want to like consciously or voluntarily give up. So I rode it till the end, until everything shut down, the wheels came off. And then in the midst of that depression is when I didn't have really formulated a safety net. I didn't have a group of other physicians who were even interested, at least in my immediate sphere of influence, even interested in psychedelics. So I'd gone way to the fringe of medicine. I'd gone way to the fringe of people that had gone that deep with the entheogenic experience. I had gone way to the fringe of dissolving my entire relationship with like this cultural paradigm. So when I came back to the States, I couldn't be around big cities, fast-moving things, people on these kinds of iPod things, and I was like, all that was different. And when I actually came back to the States, it felt like living in a microwave. You were talking about EMF exposure, and I literally felt like my energy body was getting fried. And that was somewhat because it was so fried from mania, but it was also because it was hypersensitive, and now I was in this like EMF craziness because I had been living for a year completely off the grid, deep in the jungle.
Right.
So what I didn't have was a safety net. I didn't have the back and forth kind of conversation about what was happening. I didn't have a higher perspective of this psychic matrix getting completely rebooted and reconfigured and essentially up-leveled to a new operating system. And when you up-level to a new operating system, you have to completely defrag the old operating system. So I was in the that's essentially what the bardo is, right? You're in between operating systems.
Right,
You're
right.
in between lives. So I was in this death process and in this in-between process. And it wasn't that the experience was so horrible that I couldn't bear it. It was the fear that it was never going to end. And I didn't know why it was happening. And so when we have the conversation, and that's why it's really helpful to be guided. That's why it's helpful to go with a guide up Everest, because it's a long haul, and
Right.
there are times when you're going to want to turn back. And if your guide's like, okay, now you got another hour, right? Then we rest. And then we got to summit by noon because you got to be down before the storm comes in.
And this too shall pass.
And this too shall pass. And you're in the dark forest and you don't have a map. But then all of a sudden, with this like broken flashlight, maybe by the light of the moon, because divinity comes in, there's this little bitty arrow along this path that just says go that way. And I was like, oh fuck, thank you, right?
Right.
And it was just these little kernels of conversations where there would be something that validated the experience. So me living in the tent, I lived in this tent on the backside of our property at Grace Grove. That's what took me out there, because I was like, Morgan was my only friend.
Is this when you built the cabin?
This was me coming out of the tent when I built the cabin.
Coming out of the tent.
So I was in the tent for a year, and during this depression, I'm looking up at the tent for that whole year, and I'm like, what the heck just happened? This is not what I anticipated.
Right.
This is not what I thought that we were going down for. And so there was this doubt, like, did I screw up? Did I miss something? Did I just get completely fractured and now Humpty Dumpty's not going to be put back together? And so that subsided after about a year, and that was for a variety of reasons. Largely, it was like having these kinds of conversations, eventually networking with people that had gone down that far. Or, there's this great new book by Jack Kornfield, First Enlightenment, Then the Laundry. Right? And so many people, and these are like spiritualists like yourself, talking about how they've accessed samadhi in meditation, reached these states of oneness, and then you come off of that mountain, and you're like, well, now I got to, change diapers and deal with mortgages.
I got to do my taxes?
Right. And it's hard to interface, right? You're
Totally
like, geez, I want to go back there.
No. But that's sort of the trick too. You got to live here right now.
1 foot in.
We're humans for a reason,
right.
And it's
in
just you got to be here. You got to be human. You got to do your taxes.
Eventually, and if you don't, the man will track you down.
Right.
So we have these like human kind of obligations, and they're not necessarily obligations when we engage them as choice.
Right.
Oh, I have the opportunity to do my taxes because I'm in the midst of financial abundance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a different reframe.
And that's big. Reframe.
Yeah.
Yep.
Reframing.
Yep.
And so me coming out of the tent was building my cabin, and that was another year. Just chopping wood and carrying water and coming back into my body and just having a point of focus.
That's beautiful.
And listening the whole time to just really beautiful music and other people's kinds of discussions about them going through their dark night. And then I really appreciated the value, the deep truth and benefit of going through our own personal dark night.
Yeah.
And all of my training through Western psychiatry was about rescuing, like coming in on the white horse, rescuing people from their dark night. And that's not to say that, if you're a mom of 3, a single mom of 3, going through her dark night, that's really freaking rough, right? She's got a lot of obligations. She's got a lot of
So how does a mom of
stress.
3 go through that?
Well,
without having to go through what you went through. Now you have the lessons, right?
Most people.
I
had a beautiful opportunity
What would you do different?
To have support. I had support. I had time. I had choice. I desired to stay in it. There was never any point at which I was wanting to drug it out or numb it out. I was desiring for it to end, but when I dropped into it, like like, really, is this really what I'm supposed to be doing? And so many times I wanted to just run
So you
from
just
that
had to cultivate
freaking tent.
through it.
Yeah, there was so many times I just wanted to get the heck out of that tent.
So you didn't resort to other drugs in that time period?
No, I was completely sober the whole time because I wanted to understand it. And so when I asked the question, is this really what I'm supposed to be going through? Is this really what's supposed to be happening? Every time when I could rest this mind trying to figure it all out, and I was hearing from this place and from this place, this higher wisdom and this deeper knowing, the answer was always yes. Just stay on the path. You don't have to know why. It's better that you don't know why. Because I was cultivating faith at that point. And if you have evidence, then it's proof, and you don't need to cultivate faith. Right? So that was one benefit. And in the midst of like rewiring this psychic matrix, I realized that there was a massive choice on a particular level to get dissolved so that I could recreate myself how I choose to live my life. Because prior to that moment, there was so many different ways I was living somebody else's program, somebody else's expectation of me, my own expectations of me that I just adopted from other people in the grand plan, like the big cultural, not the grand cosmic plan, but the big cultural program.
So you believe depression, especially, or manicness, or manic and depression, is something that can be cured?
Totally. Much of it is neurochemical. Sometimes, like Freud said, a cigar is a cigar. Right? So people who maybe they have a heavy metal burden because their detoxigenomic pathways are clogged, or maybe on a genetic level they have enzymes that are not completely fully functioning, so they don't detox the environmental toxins they take in. We were talking about kids on the Asperger's spectrum, very much like that.
Does it sound? I mean, what are some of the medications people are using now for depression that maybe plant medicine would actually be better at treating?
So the good question you asked earlier was like, okay, Mama 3 going through this experience of like dark night, maybe she doesn't have the opportunity maybe she doesn't have the time, the support, the presence, the desire to really stay with it. So if she's having a hard time putting food on the table for her family, then it might be reasonable to resort to a medication. Because medications are, we as Western physicians are good on the battlefield.
But it seems like, I mean, I have family members that, are dealing with depression. Everyone knows in the whole world, Robin Williams, died from that illness. So for me, it seems like nobody's getting treated. They're just, if I'm on my medication, I feel good. When I get off of it, I feel bad.
Right.
I mean, there seems like there's got to be a better solution.
When we prescribe medications, it should be for a very specific indication for a very specific period of time. I had narcolepsy. I was diagnosed with narcolepsy in medical school, which is a sleep condition where you just have these sleep attacks. And I took the equivalent of Ritalin for like 4 years. And that shit works. Speed works. It wakes you up. And then I started realizing they don't care if this ever fixes. They, being the medical industry, they're willing for me to go to the grave on this prescription. And then when I got that, I was like, oh shit, I gotta find something else that's gonna work. So when we, as physicians, are prescribing medication, it should be for a very specific period of time while we're looking at the underlying causative factors. So if somebody's going through their dark night, then it might be because that's exactly what they need to experience in order to reawaken their true best self. Right? So to realize that the relationships they're in are detrimental, their living environment's horrible, their work environment is not their passion, they're just going through the motion, making widgets, right? And well, in order to get out of that matrix, you got to start shedding all of that stuff and dealing with what's underneath and not distract. So to be able to presence it, it really helps to have a guide, a support team, people that are going to like cheerlead that process as opposed to ridicule it. Like when I was, when I went deep into the jungle, my colleagues were like, dude, you're doing what? These guys that were really good friends of mine were like, where are you at? What are you doing? You just went way off the freaking deep end. And I was like, well, I mean, I know I have to do this thing. So so I eventually...
Well, it's always fringe scientists that make the breakthrough. It's always fringe doctors that make the breakthrough. And at the time period, no one understands it. But you look back 50 years and you go, oh, yeah, that's how that breakthrough is made. But then that breakthrough is made and everyone just stays there again. And someone else has to go up here. And then, that's just how it works.
Like Tesla.
Oh yeah, Tesla's
Genius
a perfect
dude,
example.
right?
Of
But
course.
he died broke,
Talking to pigeons.
fractured. Yeah,
Literally.
not supported.
Not supported.
Right? No, not recognized for his process, his genius.
So if you could leave, just with one sentence or two sentences about, someone that's never tried floating or someone that's never tried psychedelics, what would your best advice be if you just met someone on the street, say at Whole Foods, you're in a line, what would you say to someone about, especially floating?
Well, in regards to floating, just do it. Just do it. There's no downside.
Right.
When we as physicians, particularly as physicians, look at risk-benefit ratio, it's extraordinarily in the benefit range. There's very little risk.
Right.
Right? So if I'm a betting man, I'm going to say, well, you're probably going to have a pretty good experience. And at worst case scenario, nothing happens and you fall asleep.
Right.
That's not so bad.
Right.
You
That's
get to
worst
rest.
case.
Worst case scenario
Worst
is
case,
rest.
you fall asleep.
Most
you
people need to rest
rest
anyway.
Right.
Right? As far as psychedelics go, I'd say do your research. Because the data's there. MDMA treating chronic severe
and again,
PTSD.
you're not talking about it for getting high. You're talking about it as a medicine.
Right. MDMA treating chronic severe
Or
PTSD,
psychedelic.
83% success rate.
Say that again.
MDMA treating chronic severe PTSD.
Okay.
Like
83%.
83% cure rate
Cure rate.
after 2 to 3 sessions.
That's insane.
That's what's driving now it going into phase 3 trials. Ibogaine, 66%, 2/3 of people going on heroin, going into Ibogaine, 2/3 are still clean 2 years out after one treatment.
That's insane.
So many of the psychedelics are very good at the areas that psychiatry is very weak at. And the data's there. It's readily available.
Right.
Start looking at the numbers.
Right.
And then once you know the data, and then there's a yes, then find a really good, reputable person to go through that experience.
So is there a
with.
website or resource people can use to find out more information about any of this?
For psychedelics?
Sure.
Arrowwood.
Arrowwood.
EROWID. Amber Lyons has put together a pretty good podcast series called Reset Me with a lot of
Reset Me, okay.
frontier thinkers. There are 2 really good conferences later this year, Horizons, where we talk about, I'll be speaking at Horizons, I'll be speaking at Visionary Convergence. We're talking about the data that's here now. Ayahuasca just had their first international consortium last year. It's called AYA 2014, and it was in Ibiza, Spain,
Okay.
run by a company called ICEERS,
Okay.
the International Consortium for Entheogenic Education and Research Sciences. The data is there. We've had this whole cultural program on the war on drugs and how bad it is. Well, when Portugal...
Everything being prescribed is a drug.
Right.
Let's
Well,
not
the
forget
government,
that.
like McKenna said, the government doesn't mind if you're on drugs. They just want you on their drugs. Right? But when Portugal recognized 15 years ago that 1% of the population was addicted to heroin...
1%. 1 out of 100 people.
1% of the entire Portugal population was addicted to heroin. Their war on drugs was not working, so they legalized everything.
Wow.
Including drugs and psychedelics and entheogens and whatever you want to call them. They legalized everything and drug use went down.
Right.
They took the money that was going into the war on drugs and they put it into social infrastructure.
Wow.
And they built connection.
Okay.
And they built community. And just like we were talking about earlier with Joe, the rat studies show like if you give rats in isolation unlimited cocaine water, they're going to use it until they die. They will even use it more than food.
Right.
But if you give rats in a rat park, hanging out with their rat friends doing cool rat things, unlimited use of cocaine water, you've had less than 25% of the same level of usage before with no lethality. So you've just cut use down 75% because you've built connection.
Because of the network.
Because it's more fun hanging out with you than getting doped out and tripped out and like completely numbed out.
Right.
I'd rather have fun with my buddies. You're still gonna have 25% that are like still kind of like
doing both.
They're the shamans, right? They want to hang out and they want to jump across.
Right.
But none of them died.
Right.
So their usage, even heavy users, there are going to be some because of, and we can get into all kinds of reasons maybe why, there's going to be subsets of the population that are still desiring to explore consciousness, or for whatever reason they're still desiring to use something because maybe they're not completely integrated as a whole self.
Right.
Those are the clients where we're saying, okay, let's understand more about that. let's use things like floating and meditation. Let's use things that are going to be like tools for consciousness.
Sure.
And help people go beyond their perceived limitations.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much. That's insane.
Yeah, more to come.
That's a great discussion right there.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Thank you, brother.
Dude, always a pleasure.
Awesome.
Totally.
Well, I have to mention sponsors are truerest.com and Float Pod, and then the podcast website is floatpodcast.com, and we got tons of great episodes. And man, that was amazing. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks,
Awesome.
man. Good to have you.